let's kick off. Welcome everyone to the Beginner Brewers podcast on brewing with extracts and specialty grains. Can I? Oh, right. And for those of you who are new to brewing, and for those of you who may have attended last time, I mentioned last time that really for me, one of the best possible ways of getting started in brewing beer at home is really to brew with extracts and specialty grains, and not necessarily to go the kit route. And I did discuss it in our previous webinar. You can also catch that webinar, by the way, on the YouTube channel, where I will put all webinars recorded. And really the reason for that, I'll go into as we go along of why I would prefer this method to, for instance, a kit method. Okay, so let's continue onward. Just bits and pieces about me so that you know that I'm not some sort of lunatic. I've been brewing for quite a while. It's a long journey for me. I'm the creator of the beginnerbrewer.com website. I also write a regular column in OnTap magazine on homebrewing, and I'd really encourage you to pick that magazine up, get a subscription. It's not that expensive. You can get the autumn edition for free on their website. So if you just Google OnTap magazine, I'm sure you'll find it. I also do sensory analysis, and I've been trained by the Siebel Institute, which helps me with beer judging and detecting all flavors in beer and helping people with recipe formulation and that sort of thing. And I also consult in the brewing industry in terms of marketing and beer processing. And I've been brewing for a long time. I'm still making mistakes, and I think you should expect to make a lot of mistakes when you do brewing. You know, it's a science, but it's not an exact science. There's a lot of art to it, and you will be making mistakes as you go along. Fortunately, there's one principle which I hold dear, is firstly to relax when you brew, because it's ultimately a hobby which is supposed to be fun. You're not a commercial brewer. You're not trying to make this stuff for a living. And even if you are, when I did commercial brewing for quite a while in the past, I found that the best beers were made when you are relaxed and when you are enjoying yourself rather than when you're stressing out about the beer. And the other reason you shouldn't be too worried is the principle I hold very, very central to what I do, and that is that beer wants to be made. And I mentioned that last time. I'll be mentioning it every time. Beer really does want to be made. If you look at the way beer is constructed, and we'll cover some of it today as well, it seems as though all the ingredients of beer are really aiming towards creating beer. You can almost make it accidentally. And that's definitely how it was probably discovered by early humans. 4000 BC, there are recipes for beer on Sumerian tomb walls, which suggests that, you don't have to be a very sophisticated, technologically advanced society to create beer. And it's because beer wants to be made. So don't worry too much when you're brewing. A lot of the things will take care of themselves. But today we're going to look at a particular way of brewing beer, which is using extracts plus specialty grains. You'll see that sort of nomenclature often mentioned online. So if you're looking for recipes or you're looking for additional information online and you Google extract plus specialty grains, that's sort of the official title of that method, if you like. And it's to distinguish it from all grain brewing, where you're using a mashing process, as well as distinguishing it from partial mashing, which is a different process as well. But today we're going to cover extract and specialty grains. So what are the pros and cons of this approach? And there are quite a few pros here, which is why I really prefer this method. So first one, mashing is done for you. The mashing process, as we discussed in the first webinar, is a complex process. It is really creating a kind of a malt, barley, or other grain porridge, which you have to hold it at a very specific temperature at a very specific pH for a very specific time. And that then extracts the sugars out of the barley malt, which is converted from its natural starch form into sugars through enzymatic action. So there are actual enzymes in the malt already present, which converts the starch into sugar. And sugar is, of course, the main ingredient for beer, because yeast eats sugar and it creates alcohol and CO2 as a byproduct. So, but mashing is tricky. You'll see a lot of people talk about mash efficiency, and they worry about their mash efficiency, and that'll be a topic of a different webinar. But the nice thing about extract and specialty grain method is that the mashing is already done for you by expert, people who do this for a living. The nice thing about using this method is you still learn the fundamentals of brewing. That's really, really important. The main problem I have with kits, other than they just sort of not much fun, as far as I'm concerned, is that you don't really learn the fundamentals of brewing beer. It's a just add water method. It's made to be like that. It's made to be super simple. Obviously, that's the whole point of a kit. But in doing so, you kind of never really learn the fundamentals of good brewing, and you sort of pick them up by accident. And in another level, when I teach beer schools to people, I often find that kit brewing has taught them some bad habits. They're not sure about, the use of boiling, for instance, and why it's important, and why a full volume boil, which you do in this method of extract and specialty grains, is so important. So for me, I would, if I were you starting out in this hobby, skip directly, skip kits, do not pass begin, do not collect $200, and go directly to extract and specialty grains as your first introductory method. Another real advantage is that you have full control over the hop varieties and other ingredient additions. So in kit brewing, you are pretty much going to brew the kit which it says on the box. So if it says you're making an Irish stout, that's what you're going to make. The extracts used in kits are pre-hopped, so it means that they have hop extracts added. So you're not really adding the hops yourself. So it means that you cannot control what varieties you use. You cannot control the freshness of your product. And there is a real difference between using actual hops versus hop extract. It's similar to most other food products where there's a difference between the actual thing and the extract of that thing. And what I find is that hop extracts, for instance, have a very blunt flavor, as opposed to fresh hops, which are pelletized hops as we use in brewing, tends to have more layered flavors. And also, you're really limiting yourself overly if you use hop extracts, because there are hundreds of different varieties of hops to use when you start adding your own hops to beer, and that contributes to having a lot of access to a lot of different styles. There are less equipment required. So if you don't have to do all grain brewing and you don't do your own mash, then you can pretty much start this method by using equipment you probably already own. And I'll cover that in a little while. So a lot of the stuff you already have in your kitchen at home will suffice for brewing with extracts and specialty grains. And later on, when you want to go into mashing, you can start becoming a little bit more complex in the equipment you use. And also, by the way, in terms of the difference between this and kit brewing, there isn't a really big difference in terms of the equipment you might require. And then finally, you have access to loads of beer styles. That really is an important point. The kits, they are becoming better. Obviously, they're bringing out more and more kits every year. But when you start with extract and specialty grain methods, you can really almost brew all the beer styles, which you can see in a manual like the BJCP style guide or other style guides. There are a few which are difficult, and that's actually one of the cons of this method. But for most styles of beer, whether you like IPAs or APAs or British ales or Belgian ales, you can brew them. So even if there's not a kit available for that beer, using this method, you probably can access it. Some cons, it's not all, plain sailing. You do have less control over the body of beer. So one of the key things mashing accomplishes is by different temperatures and lengths of mashing, you will control the amount of fermentable sugar and non-fermentable sugar in a beer. And that ratio actually is what gives beer body. So if you drink a beer which has a very dry finish and a very light body, so it has a light mouthfeel almost, that is a different ratio of fermentable sugar and non-fermentable sugar than a beer which has a heavy body, which is more tongue coating and perhaps less dry. And that is what you can control through mashing. So that you don't really have control over because, like I said earlier, mashing is done for you. So that is one piece of control you do lose. Some styles are difficult to recreate using this method. For instance, if you are a fan of wheat beers, and I know many of you are, It is a little bit difficult to create a wheat beer using this method because it's not easy to find wheat extracts, pure wheat extracts anyway. So in other words, not pre-hopped or anything like that. You can get them occasionally. They all come from overseas in liquid form. So that's one of the limitations. Is some of your specific styles are a little bit difficult to recreate, and for that you need to go for all grain brewing. And it is more expensive than all grain brewing, but it's certainly less expensive than kits. Buying base malts, if you're doing all grain brewing, is quite cheap in comparison to buying malt extract, because obviously you're paying for the mashing having been done for you. You're paying for that additional value being added. But buying dried malt extract in its pure form is way cheaper than buying a kit, for instance. Kits are really expensive. I must admit, I don't always obviously follow what's happening in the kit world. I occasionally, check it out, but I was kind of a little bit shocked the other day when I saw what prices they're charging for these things. It is a little bit heavy, whereas, dried malt extract, you can buy, quite a bit of that for $100. And that'll be enough for you for, depending on the volume of brewing you're doing, two brews at least. So dried malt extract is pretty cheap stuff in comparison. And by the way, as we go along, if you have questions which occur to you, rather drop them in the chat now, otherwise you're going to forget what the question was. So please do drop it in the chat so I can return to it at the end of the podcast. Not the podcast, the webinar, sorry. I just recorded a podcast recently, so now I'm in podcast mode. Let's move on. So how do we get started? I want to cover the basic method of extract and specialty grains brewing, just to give you a feel for what you would be doing if you adopt this approach. I'm not going to go into great detail. That will also be a topic of a different webinar, I think, when we really delve deeply into the method. Also, I plan to be hosting some online beer schools, so beer training. That unfortunately will not be free, but I'll post some more information for you all on the Facebook page as well as on my website. So that's really where we can get, down into the weeds of brewing. But I want to give you today a sort of an overview of what it is that you'll do and some of the key points of this method. So the first thing you'll notice when you do this method is you're going to be using actual malt. Okay, that's the specialty grains, which I spoke of. So again, it teaches you some fundamentals of brewing, that you'll be handling malt and understanding how to use it. And you'll be steeping your specialty grains at about 70 to 77 degrees Celsius. It's a pretty wide range. It's pretty forgiving because you're not mashing. What you're doing here is you're really creating a kind of a malt tea. And the temperature range for that tea is pretty wide. In fact, I could have said 0 to 77. So you could technically cold steep these specialty grains to extract the flavor, although it doesn't really have any benefits I've detected. It's not like cold brewed coffee, for instance, which has some benefits. So generally speaking, you're going to steep these specialty grains for about 30 minutes or so in a typical brew at 70 to 77 degrees Celsius. 77 is sort of the upper limit. You don't really want to go above that because then it starts extracting tannin out of the grain, which imparts a kind of a mouth-puckering, unpleasant flavor to your beer. You can't remove it once it's in there. So it's best to kind of err on the side of caution and really stay within this range. And of course, to steep it successfully, as you can see from the photo here, the grains have to be cracked, right? They're not whole grain. So fortunately, specialty grains don't require milling in the traditional sense of the word because they're already quite brittle. And these specialty grains are grains like crystal malts and black malt and roasted malts. So they've already been treated with some form of heat. They've either been stewed in a sort of anaerobic environment, or they've been kilned, or they've actually been roasted. In the case of like your dark malts, they actually roast them in these giant kilns and ovens. So because of that, they become brittle. I mean, you can really crush them with your hand. You certainly cannot do that with a base grain, which is what you use in malting. So when you do all grain brewing, you would normally have them milled, or you would mill them yourself with a grain mill. But if you use this method, what's kind of cool about it is you can either obviously ask your homebrew store to pre-mill your grain. That's one method. The disadvantage of that is it makes your grain a little bit less likely to last as long. So if you do use that, if you ask your homebrew store to mill your grain, make sure that you kind of use it quite quickly, because your shelf life of milled grain is sort of at most about 3 months, and then it starts really deteriorating quite rapidly. Unmilled grains can last much, much longer. And so with the specialty grains, as I said, they're brittle. Nice thing is you can put them in a bag and roll a rolling pin or a empty wine bottle over them, and it'll crack them quite sufficiently for your purposes in steeping them. Okay. So once you've cracked the husk, it allows for the sugars which are in these grains, because they've kind of already been converted into sugar forms, and that's why they don't require mashing. And then it will create color and flavor for your beer. So often the color which your water is at the end of the steeping process will pretty much be the color of your end product, of your end beer, because the extract you use, the malt extract, doesn't have much color of its own. So it's also kind of a cool principle that at the end of the steep, you kind of already know, give or take, a few degrees Lovibond, what your beer will look like. Okay, the equipment here, you can see you obviously need some sort of bag, and there are two substances you need this bag to be made from, and I'll cover that a little bit later. But that's the first step. Also, the other thing you'll notice about this method, which is not obvious from the picture, is that you use full volume of water. Okay, that's different from in kit brewing, where you sort of use partial volumes of water and then you add water later before you add the kit to the fermenter. In this method, you start with the amount of water you want to end up with. Well, you actually start with more because we're going to be boiling it, so lots of evaporation takes place. But you always start with a full volume. So as a rule of thumb, if you are brewing 19 liters of beer, which is a common batch size for homebrewers, you'll probably start with around 26 liters or so of water, depending on how vigorous your boil is and depending on how high you are above sea level. So if you're in Cape Town, your boiling point is 100 degrees, where I am in Joburg, our boiling point is around 95 degrees. So it does change the amount of evaporation you experience. Okay, so that's the first thing, is you use full volume, and that's got some massive advantages in beer taste, flavor stability, and many other things which I'll cover as we go along. Step one done. I promise the others I will try and talk less, but we still have to get through all of this. The step two is you're going to add some dried malt extract. This stuff is a very fine sort of cream colored powder. You do get liquid malt extract, which is just the liquid form of this, and it's not pre-hopped or anything. So do check that before you use a liquid extract, because some of them are pre-hopped and you don't want to be using that. But I really like dried malt extract. It's made in large quantities in South Africa because it's used in many different food products. Things like Horlicks and Milo all have it in it. Horlicks is pretty much almost just entirely made out of dried malt extract. So it's made in large quantities. So it means it's often fresh when you buy it. It is very stable across time, so you can store it for a long time. You can store it in the fridge, or you can store it in a cool, dark place. And it's very likely that it'll be fresh. It's not susceptible to mold, which unfortunately is a problem with liquid malt extracts. It can grow mold, where this doesn't. So I really favor this stuff. It's well made in South Africa. It's really done exceptionally well. So you'll add this now to your water. At about 70 degrees Celsius or so, and you'll mix in the dried malt extract. Again, the amount you use will depend on the recipe, but for, again, a kind of a 19-liter batch, depending on the style, it'll be somewhere between 2 to 4 kilograms of dried malt extract. 4 kilograms would be like a very heavy, high-gravity beer, like a double IPA or something like that. Most beers, you'll be around 2 kgs. If you use smaller batches, which I also do recommend people starting with, it's far less, right? You'll be using maybe 500 grams of this stuff. So a little goes a long way with dried malt extract. Then you will start the boil. Now I hope you can see the video. This is actually me doing a full volume boil the other day. We'll try and play it again. It's not very long. And you can see here, this is really a good video of a proper full volume boil. Sorry about the shaky cam. I'm still learning how to become a filmographer. And you can see it's a full. This is a 5-liter batch I'm making, and I'm using around about sort of 7 liters of water to begin with. And this is after I've added the dried malt extract. It's a good idea to always bring the liquid up to a boil once you've added the malt extract. You should never, ever add dried malt extract to boiling water. That's a bad idea. It will explode, making a big mess and potentially harming you, because it's a very fine powder. And I mean, it's just going to be a boil over for sure if you add it to boiling water. So rather bring it up to the boil. Now, this foam at the bottom of the pot, you can see, is actually because of the dried malt extract now having been incorporated into the brew water. And we call it a full rolling boil, because what's happening really is the entire content of that liquid is rolling over. So everything is being boiled. There's no patches in this liquid which is not at boiling temperatures. And this is on my stovetop. So that's another advantage of small batches. I mean, and I don't have a very sophisticated hob or anything. It is gas. I do like my gas hob, but I've done this on electric stovetops as well. For small volumes of water like this, you don't need to go further than your kitchen to achieve a good rolling boil. And you'll notice this is a stock pot. I'll talk about that a little bit later, of why that it's important. And now it's boiling, and you're going to boil it. Most beers you will boil for about an hour. Sometimes some recipes call for a 90-minute boil, but I find when you use extracts, it's best to try and keep to 60 minutes and not go more than that, because there are some dangers here of creating caramelization. So it's the extract, because it's a very fine powder, can burn. And if you boil it for very long, it increases the chances that your beer gets a bit of a caramel-like flavor, which in some styles are fine, but you don't really want to do that inadvertently. Okay, so step 3. Now, during this step, you're going to be adding hops. So this is probably more like step 3.1. So as you boil, you're going to be adding hops. Depending on the style you're making, you'll be adding either the hops to the beginning of the boil. In other words, they'll be boiling for a longer period of time. And those sort of additions will create bitterness in the beer. That's what we often call the bittering hop, which we're adding. So often these hop varieties have high bitterness levels. It's measured in something called alpha acid as a percentage. And so anything sort of above 6% alpha acid is considered reasonably high. Nowadays, you get hops which have been bred to be super high bittering hops. They can go up to sort of 15 to 19% alpha acid. So you don't need to add a lot of them to add bitterness to the beer. And the longer the hop is boiled, the more of this bitterness is extracted. The disadvantage, of course, is that if you boil up for very long, the flavor compounds dissipate. So you'll notice when you start doing this method, one of the great fun parts of it is when you add hops to boiling wort, you really get that aroma sort of releasing, exploding out of the kettle. And unfortunately, the fact that you're smelling it means that some of that compound is being lost to, vapor. And if you boil hops for long enough, you will lose most of that flavor compound. So the reason why you add hops later in the boil is to introduce the flavor of hops into the beer. So when you add hops, let's say 10 minutes before the end of the boil, you will get a lot of the flavor compounds staying inside of that wort, okay, which is the name for the boiling liquid, WRT. If you add it right at the end of the boil, you'll get a lot of the aroma compounds. So the scent of hops becomes part of your beer then. So you can see by layering the hop additions, you're actually starting to construct your beer. You're really building the beer from scratch. And that's what I love about this method. You don't get to do this sort of stuff in kit brewing. But in this method, you really are. You're building the beer from scratch. You are doing exactly the same thing as a commercial brewer does when they, brew thousands of liters of beer, because they still do the same thing. If you go visit a craft brewery, if you have time, and if you do a tour while they're brewing, or you're lucky enough to see that, that's exactly what they do. They open the kettle and they chuck some hops into the boil, just way more of it. So you're really mimicking that method, and it's great fun, because now you can start constructing your own beers and to your own flavor requirements. At the end of the boil, you'll do a whirlpool. Okay, it's called a whirlpool. And in home brewing, all you're going to do really is you're going to stir the liquid vigorously. You'll switch off the heat and you'll stir the liquid for a few minutes. Good idea, by the way, to wear an oven glove or something while you do this, because the amount of heat being released from, even as little as 6 liters of wort, and certainly way more if you're doing a bigger batch, can kind of burn you. So just remember, safety is something you can't just ignore. So you're going to do this for a few minutes. And the reason you're doing this is you are kind of cooling down the wort a little bit, but not much. You're really doing it so that you collect all the leftovers from the hops you've added. If you added any other ingredients like herbs or fruit or anything, that will collect in the middle of the kettle, which is the fancy name for your stock pot. And it makes it easier when you then transfer the wort later on into your fermenter, that stuff doesn't go into the fermenter. That's really the reason for whirlpooling. So it's taking all the proteins, all the leftover stuff which you don't want in your beer, and it's putting it in the middle of the kettle to help you out. You can also add hops here, by the way. It's a very common method nowadays if you want to create very hoppy beers, is to add hops in the whirlpool. And it really extracts a lot of flavor and aroma compounds out of the hop. I brew quite a few beers with whirlpool hops added, and commercially I've brewed a lot of those. So it really adds a very nice hop kick to your beer without a lot of bitterness, which is the real reason you're doing that. Step 6 is you're going to chill your wort. Now here's a picture of the immersion wort chiller. So it's basically copper coils which you run cold water through, and you put that in the wort usually about 5 minutes before the end of the boil. So you sterilize these copper coils. You still have to clean them before you put them in the wort. You can't just use them dirty. And then you run water through it, and that chills out the beer. You don't have to invest in this piece of equipment, really. I just thought it's a nice picture. You can also put it in an ice pot. So if you filled that sink, which I'm showing in the picture, the wash basin with ice, and you put a pot in that, you will be more than able to chill out your wort to the right temperature. Even large batches. So if you're using a much bigger pot, you can, for instance, get a galvanized metal bath and just put a lot of ice in it, or make your own big pieces of ice out of just putting water in a Ziploc container and sticking it in your freezer. And you can chill it out that way. I did that for many years before I bought a immersion wort. Well, I actually made my first immersion wort chiller, and then I bought one which was properly made because I'm not a very good handyman. But you don't have to get there right away. And thanks, by the way, for the questions which you're dropping in the chat. Please keep them coming. I'd really like to be able to help you out as we go along or at the end of the webinar. Okay. After chilling, you're going to pitch your yeast. This is a picture of someone pitching liquid yeast, but often you will use rehydrated dry yeast, which is important to rehydrate. There's lots of advantages to rehydrating dry yeast and not just chucking it directly into the wort. And here, when you're pitching yeast, you kind of want to keep the temperature range within 17 to 25 degrees Celsius. It's pretty wide, and different yeasts have different tolerances for these temperatures, but most yeast used commercially for beer brewing will tolerate this sort of temperature. It's somewhere between 17 and 25. Underneath 17, it becomes a little bit more likely that your yeast might go into a shock state, which means it doesn't immediately start fermenting. And over 25, you might extract flavor compounds out of the yeast, which is not desirable for the beer you're making. So it might have a very banana-y type flavors coming out of the fermentation. So unless you are making something like a Belgian ale or a wheat beer, which has that as a normal flavor profile, you're not going to like it in your beer. Okay, and yeast can tolerate high temperatures. I mean, you don't necessarily kill yeast above 25 degrees Celsius. It is a fungus, by the way, for those of you who are wondering. Yeast is part of the fungus class of organisms, and it's very, very robust. It's made to be robust, obviously. Over the last 100 years or so, commercial yeast labs have cultivated yeast to be robust. So the yeast you're putting in your beer, has a pretty good pedigree behind it. So you're not going to kill it. You're not going to. I've seen on some of the homebrew channels and on Facebook people talking about, you killed your yeast if it's above 25 or at 30. It's not likely. Yeast is quite temperature tolerant both ways. I mean, yeast is very temperature tolerant at lower temperatures as well. Freezing yeast will kill it or destroy it. There are ways of freezing yeast, but you have to put gelatin in it, and it's very complicated, and I'm not going to get into it. But yeah, yeast, pretty tough stuff. And then finally, you're going to ferment your beer, right? That's the really important process where beer gets made by the yeast. We often say in brewing, a brewer just sort of creates the conditions for yeast to make the beer for you, but yeast is the true creator of beer. And you're going to be using a kind of a fermentation bucket like the one pictured here. Obviously, for smaller batches, you'll use less of a big bucket. You can use a smaller one, or for large batches, you'll just up the size. And for ales, you try and ferment them at around 16 to 25 degrees Celsius. Also a very wide range, because different styles call for different temperatures of fermentation. The main point here is to try and keep your temperature as consistent as possible. So commercial brewers do that by putting their beer in these giant, and you may have seen them, giant stainless steel fermenters with jackets around them. So these jackets contain coils which run across the entire fermenter, and they pump things like glycol through it at a very specific temperature, and it's actually got an electronic controller which ensures that that fermentation stays at a very exact temperature for very long periods of time. Now, you don't have that, obviously, unless you're super wealthy, in which case, please stay after the webinar. I'd like to talk to you. But all jokes aside, you really don't have access to that. So there are many different ways of ensuring a stable fermentation. The probably more expensive way is if you happen to be lucky enough to have a separate fridge, which you keep somewhere, a second fridge. You can buy from homebrew shops either analog or electronic controllers, which bypass the normal thermostat of the fridge and helps you run the fridge at higher temperatures, because fridges are created to make things cold. Like 4 degrees Celsius is usually the best temperature for a fridge to be at. Now, you're not really going to be fermenting at 4 degrees. So to push a fridge to be able to go up to, let's say, 16 degrees Celsius, you need to bypass its thermostat. So that's the more expensive solution, because not all of us have the space or the money for a second fridge. The much more obvious solution is to rather invest in a thermometer, right? Preferably an electronic one which can record temperatures, and put this thermometer around your house in various places. Try the closet, try the basement, try, wherever. Depending on the tolerance of your significant others for this sort of thing, you can maybe even put it in your lounge, although your visitors might look at you funny. And try and figure out which room in your house, which location in your property has the best temperature for what you're trying to do and the most stable temperature. You usually will find a place. In my house, for instance, to give you an example, it is my study, which I'm very lucky to have, and it's the bathroom in my study, which I'm also lucky to have. So when I put it in that room, it maintains a pretty stable temperature. Maybe it's your garage, right? Although garages, in my experience, generally not a great idea, because they vary in temperature greatly every time the garage door opens. So go find the place which will be best for you. Another way is you can sort of do the swamp cooler method, where you put your fermenter inside of a larger container filled with water, and then you add ice blocks and so on to keep the water at a certain temperature, which will obviously keep the fermenter at a certain temperature. It takes maintenance, though, right? Adding ice blocks to the fermenter, or not the fermenter, the container every day is a bit of a pain in the ass. So, you may start neglecting that duty. So, but there are different methods here. Obviously, making lagers require much lower temperatures of fermentation, and that is why a lot of homebrewers don't actually go out and brew lagers right away. It took me a long time to brew my first lager as a homebrewer, and as a commercial brewer, I vowed never to brew a lager. So I just think there's a lot of lagers out there, and I don't need to add any more to the world. So ales are really perfectly fine. There are hundreds of different styles of ales you can brew. And if you really are adamant about the lager as your favorite beer, you'd be happy to know that there are ales which are very similar to lager in taste profile, which you can brew at these temperatures. So even though you may not have a means to create lagers right away when you start home brewing, there are ales like the blonde ale, for instance, the Kolsch ale. Those are all very similar in some ways to lagers in their flavor profiles. And then time-wise, depending on the style and the temperature you're fermenting at, it'll be anywhere from about 10 to 21 days on average to ferment out your beer completely and make it ready to bottle. You can do it less. It can take less time. And certain styles do call for a very quick fermentation, but most beers actually benefit from time. Okay, so not rushing it. Again, please drop any questions you have, anything which comes to mind, anything you want to ask in the chat, please, and I will try and address it. And then finally, step 9 is my least favorite part, and most brewers' least favorite part is bottling. Okay, you can see quite a few of them, and there are the bottle caps there in the picture as well shown. it is a bit of a bane of most homebrewers. It's not the most fun part, but I must say there is nothing quite as satisfying as seeing a whole bunch of your own beer in a bottle with a cap on, ready to go into the next step, and it is very, very satisfying. You will at this stage find more experienced brewers maybe tell you, just skip bottling, just keg your beer. You certainly can. Kegging is much easier because as opposed to putting your beer in, let's say, 30 to 40 bottles, you can just put it in 1 or 2 kegs. I mean, you can imagine the effort involved is far less. But kegging comes with its own problems. Obviously, it's expensive sometimes to buy the equipment, and to ensure carbonation in a keg is an art in and of itself. And I have to admit, I haven't met a lot of homebrewers beginning in the hobby who can do this properly. And even some experienced homebrewers sometimes battle with carbonation in a keg, because that is a pretty hectic science to get into. But it certainly is an option. I don't want to dissuade you. I have kegs. I have a nice tap at home here, and it's very satisfying to put some of your homebrew on a tap and serve it, just like you're at the pub, to your guests and to yourself. I mean, it's a very satisfying experience. So definitely, if you have the funds and the time, kegging is very much worth it. And that's the final step, man. That's what it's all about, right? Sharing your homebrew with friends, family. It's a wonderful thing. It's still, even though I've been doing this for a long time, it still gives me a kick to see someone sort of be surprised at the fact that they're drinking something I made, and it's better maybe even than the commercial beer they used to. It's deeply satisfying. Okay, let's see what you need to start with this method. So I thought it would be good to kind of go through the gear you will need, and that'll give you a good indication of the sort of investment you may have to make if you're just starting out. And it's not a lot. I mean, that's the nice thing about this method is you don't need to break the bank really in starting out with extracting specialty grains. So here are a couple of things you may already have. For 5-liter batches, definitely you will have some of these things. So if you start out with small batch brewing, which is a great fun. I mostly do small batch brewing nowadays because I just don't have the time for large batch brewing. Also, I was dumb enough to injure myself, and I'm recovering from an operation right now, and I can't lift heavy things. So, it means that large batch brewing is sort of out of the question for me. So if you have a 9 to 12 liter stock pot, you can start with this method right away at 5 liters. You will use your stovetop. You need a large whisk or a wooden spoon to stir stuff with. You need a couple of mason jars, those console sort of jam jars, just to rehydrate your yeast in and so on. A metal sieve comes in handy, but is not required, but it is useful to pass your wort through a sieve as you chuck it into the fermenter, because it will strain out any last remaining protein residue, and it helps to clarify your beer. Kitchen scale, really important. I cannot stress that enough. You cannot brew beer without measuring stuff. I mean, it's just that sort of cowboy brewing is not going to give you good results. So even if you are someone who likes more the art of brewing than the science of brewing, I think a bare minimum measurement of weight, weighing your ingredients is really required. Thermometer also is the other measurement instrument I would invest in if I were you. And there's so many different varieties of thermometers you can buy, from the sort of glass ones, which a lot of homebrew stores stock, to those instant read ones, which you get at cooking stores. They're all good. They all do the job. I like glass thermometers, but I break them, regularly, which is a pain. And if you break your thermometer inside of your wort, then you've got to, you've basically wasted your day. Whereas if you use the electronic ones, they're a little bit more robust. And with 19 liter batches, you have less probably already. So still some of the things are the same. So what I've listed there, you can obviously use, but you will need to buy a few more items if you're going to do 19 liter batches. So here are some of the things you may need to acquire by any means necessary. Don't steal. I'm not advocating stealing. So in 5 liter batches, you will need 2 fermentation buckets. Okay, so 2 is useful because the one you'll be using to ferment your beer and the other one you'll be using to bottle your beer in. And it's called a bottling bucket for that reason, but it's the same as the fermentation bucket. Also, you just want a backup. You may scratch your primary fermentation bucket, or the cat might sleep in it or something, and that's happened to me. And so having a backup is not a bad thing to have. You will buy a rubber grommet and airlock, which you'll put in on top of that bucket so that it seals it from the outside world, but allows the CO2, which forms during fermentation, to escape. And these are really things you can't make yourself. You can. Technically, you can make anything yourself, I guess. But the airlock is more difficult to make. You can make one out of a tubing which goes into a mason jar filled with water. I've seen it. I've done it myself. But I prefer some of the things you need to buy. Then, as I mentioned, you will need a voile or a muslin bag, which is what you're going to be using to steep your grains. You only need one of these two substances because it's fine enough. The mesh is fine enough not to let the grains fall through, but to let the flavor and compounds get through. Voile is my preferred material for bag construction. It's the stuff they make those old-fashioned curtains from, the ones you can't see through. And do try and get the really high quality cotton ones, and not the ones which are sort of made out of nasty stuff. And the difference is that the nasty stuff is kind of shiny, and the good quality voile is not. But muslin is also a perfectly acceptable alternative material for steeping your grains. You will need to get sanitizer. Okay, it's not something you can just probably have on hand. So some sort of sanitizer which your homebrew shop will supply you with. And there are two kinds of sanitizers. It's the easy kind and the hard kind. The easy kind is the one which is called no rinse sanitizer. So it means that literally you will soak whatever you sanitize in that, and then you can use it. Don't have to rinse it again. But the rinse sanitizers are also there. They're often cheaper and unfortunately more common. That you would have to rinse with water. So it does add an additional step in your sanitizing regime. Get a spray bottle, right? To put sanitizer in, to spray stuff with, and also another spray bottle to put water in. It's a useful thing to have a spray bottle filled with brew water handy when you're doing your boil, because you can avoid boil overs. If you add hops, for instance, to your boil, and you can see, oh boy, this thing's going to boil over and make a mess, you can spray some water on top and it will prevent the boil over. So that's a pretty cool thing to do. If you're going to do a 5-liter batch, you will need around 11 to 14 brown glass bottles to bottle your beer. And that's assuming it's sort of the typical 440 craft beer kind of bottle. Always have more than you need, because you never know. You could break a bottle on bottling day, or again, one could look a bit dodgy, and then you don't have another one. So have more than you need. So not a lot, more than possible for you to create your own empties. I know there is a practice where you buy brand new bottles, and it is obviously nice to buy a brand new bottle. I would say it's slightly nicer to buy a brand new bottle with some beer in it already, and drink that beer and then save that bottle. And a kind of a cool tip here, by the way, if you want to start doing that, just become a little bit more disciplined in how you treat your bottles. After you've poured the beer into a glass, because I know that you guys are sophisticated beer drinkers, you don't drink right out of the bottle. No one should ever do that. Just squirt a little bit of dishwash liquid in the bottle, put some water in it, rinse it, put it in the dry rack. And if you do that, you're never going to have a real pain in cleaning your bottles. And do that again with your homebrew as well. You can reuse these bottles a lot. I'm still using bottles which I started with, and that's like more than 10 years ago now. So you can keep them for a long, long time. Crown caps and capper. So those are the caps which you saw earlier. You're going to put them on the bottle, and you're going to use some sort of capper to seal it. That's why you can only use bottles which had that cap on it. So you can only use a bottle which required you to open it with a actual bottle opener. You cannot use bottles which have a twist cap on it. You also, by the way, shouldn't drink beer which has twist caps on it. I'm just kidding. I'm being a beer snob. But generally, better beers to be found in bottled beer, which you need to actually open. And you need to have brown glass bottles. So don't use green glass bottles, or clear is even worse. UV light does actually damage beer flavor and beer stability. So that's why when you drink a beer out of a green bottle, it's often got a funky flavor or scent to it, aroma to it because of that. It's actually called skunking a beer. And the reason it's called skunking is the chemical compound which is formed by the UV light getting into the malt is in fact identical to skunk urine. That's what makes skunk urine smell the way it does. So it's unpleasant stuff. And if you want to experience skunking a beer, just pour any beer into a glass and leave it outside in your garden for the sun to have its way with it, and you will smell and taste the difference of skunk beer. So brown glass filters out UV light. And so that's why brown glass is often preferred. You'll see most craft brewers nowadays will use only brown bottles or can their beer. That's obviously the way to prevent any UV from penetrating. Okay, with 19-liter batches, you need a little bit more. You will need definitely to buy a stock pot. Very few people I know just have a 30-liter stock pot lying around their house. If you do, you're very lucky, or you like brewing, cooking a hell of a lot of stock or soup. You will need a high-pressure gas burner. Most stovetops will not have the kind of heat capacity to bring 26 liters of water up to a rolling boil. It just wouldn't. It's not going to happen. It'll simmer that, and that's not what you want. You want a full rolling boil. So what you really want is you want a high-pressure gas burner, which you'll attach to a gas bottle, and you'll use it somewhere where there's great ventilation. So mostly you will use it in your garage or outdoors. But that is enough to bring it to boil, and I'll show you a picture of it in a little while. Same, you will use larger fermentation buckets, usually about 25-liter capacity. Obviously, because you can have more beer. Same story with your other equipment. Same stuff. Your voil bag will just be larger because you're going to fit it into a larger pot, of course. But what's nice is you can just buy a really large one for both these, and it will be fine. You're still going to use sanitizer and all the other good stuff. Now, here's the rub, which is also why brewing large batches of beer can be quite of a task, is you're going to need, about 46 bottles, to bottle a 19-liter batch. That's a lot of bottles, right? To manage, firstly, you have to put it somewhere so it's not going to fall over and so on, and that's fun and games of its own, which I will, leave you to explore on your own. But it's a hell of a lot of beer. And although that might make you go, yeah, of course, I want lots of beer, just really do consider that you have to actually grate that much beer and drink it. And, if you mess it up, it's a whole bunch of bad beer you've got on your hands. So again, if you're new to this, I really would recommend starting small because it gives you a chance to really get to know the hobby and really experiment with it and so on. But by all means, I didn't start small, so I'm giving you counsel I didn't follow myself. I started with 19 liters and didn't look back. But it's a mission to bottle that much beer. Obviously, you'll know when you start really getting into the hobby where you start looking at what's the largest possible bottle I can put my beer. And, like those 750 ml quart bottles are really nice. I got a few of them in my garage for that reason, because it just reduces the number of bottles you need. And you can also buy I use champagne bottles. If you're someone who drinks a lot of champagne, in which case, I can only imagine what nice life you lead. You can use that because champagne bottles, unlike normal wine bottles, are pressure vessels. They can take the pressure of natural carbonation forming inside of them, and you can cap them. The tops are usually just the right size for a normal beer cap. So that's another thing you can employ, and they are, of course, quite large. So it does help a lot. Let us move on. So you're still going to obviously need all the equipment to cap your beer. I want to take a bit of a closer look at equipment so that you really know what this stuff looks like. It's all fine and well me talking about it, but I want to show you, and I want to talk a little bit about what you should look out for when you go and buy this stuff. So stock pots, right? This is a stock pot. A stock pot is a pot which is taller than it is wide. Okay, that's really important. You'll notice that commercial kettles in a craft brewery also, they're tall, right? They're wide and tall, but they're taller than they are wide. And the reason for that is it simply concentrates the heat so that you can achieve a good rolling boil. The wider the pot, the more heat you have to produce to create a rolling boil, to the point where some pots are so wide that it's virtually impossible to create a good rolling boil. Also, you want to concentrate the liquid in a sort of a tight ball, if you like. The reason I say that is it helps you utilize hops more efficiently. So the more the hops can be concentrated in this rolling ball of water, the more bitterness and flavor compounds you can extract from it. Whereas if it's lying everywhere in a very wide sort of vessel, it's not going to be good for you. So that's what you want. You don't want that kind of pot. So pots which are wider than they are tall, or equally wide as they are tall, is not really ideal for brewing. So that's probably why you will have to buy one of these things, because most homes don't have stock pots. You don't really, you're not a chef. You don't make large quantities of stock at home. But if you do, great. Here is the burner I spoke of earlier, high pressure burner. This is in fact the one I use at home when I'm not doing it on the stovetop. And these you can go buy at any kind of gas supply, or guys who sell Weber's and that sort of shop would have it. And your builders, warehouses, and so on would also stock these. They're not that pricey, and they last pretty much forever. They cast iron, so then they don't break. They last forever. And they're pretty simple things. Now you can see here, this one has a sort of almost like a flower-like pattern of gas ejection ports. You get much bigger ones than this. You get ones which, if you look at that ring over here, they're ones with several rings around them. You don't need those, okay? I know the temptation sometimes is when you get to the store and you think, I'm going to buy myself a reasonable thing here, and then you end up going home with something which can be seen from space. Okay, if your burner can be seen from space when you light that baby, it's way too big. Okay, there are burners which are meant to actually heat large vessels, massive vessels. The craft brewery I used to work in, we actually boiled. You could boil like up to 1,000 liters of wort with some of these burners, and that's way too big for you. You are going to melt stuff. You are going to melt whatever's around this burner. It's just not needed. So this is about as big as you need for typical 19-liter batches, okay? Very important. The burner itself is not actually what creates the high pressure. It's this thing. This is the regulator of a high pressure burner. You'll see it looks very different to that, which is the low pressure regulator, which you normally find on most gas sort of appliances. So you will need to buy this high pressure regulator. This little doohickey here at the top, which sort of looks like a screw, is what you tighten to create the pressure and differential, and you adjust it with that. But mostly the adjustments which they have on them are fine. And this is actually what converts low pressure gas, which you have in your gas bottle, into high pressure, which makes the burner way more efficient. And you'll see the difference when you light this thing up. It's a real sort of heavy duty flame, which gives you that rolling ball. So if you don't have this and you connect the burner I'm showing on screen to a low pressure, you just have a pretty big low pressure burner, which is not the same as a high pressure burner. So to go look out for these, they are, again, you can find them at specialty gas shops and so on. They sometimes a little bit tricky to get hold of, but much more common nowadays than they used to be. Okay, Airlocks. That's the next one you're going to do. So this is one I said it's sort of, you kind of have to buy it. There are different types. You get these bubbler types, which is the most common. The 3-piece type airlocks are very nice. I quite like them. I wouldn't really say they're better. They're just nicer to use for me. It's a personal preference thing, but both will do you good. And then the airlock grommet is this little brown little rubber gasket, which you fit around the neck of the bubbler before it goes into the fermenter's top. And it just seals the whole assembly so that bad stuff can't get in. And then that's really the reason for it. And usually you will fill this airlock with some kind of sterile liquid. You can use sterilizer, although the problem with sterilizer liquid is unless, if you use a no rinse sterilizer liquid, it doesn't stay sterile forever. It has a shelf life of usually about 2 or 3 days. And so, it's not ideal because then it's just normal water. So rather use something like if you have access to alcohol nowadays with COVID, I guess everyone has some form of sterilizing alcohol around, or you can use vodka. So vodka is a high enough, although it's not, vodka is not high enough to reduce the risk for stuff like COVID. It is quite a high alcohol for bacteria, which is known to affect beer. And wild yeast also cannot survive very easily in such a high alcohol environment, which is your other potential contaminant. So you can use vodka. So that's what I use. I have a super cheap bottle of vodka I'll never be tempted to drink, and I use that airlocks. Okay, let's look at fermenters. This is your typical food grade plastic fermentation bucket, which many of you have seen before. And depending on the size of your batch, you will have different sizes. And it's useful, rule of thumb, to at least try and have at least about 2 liters or so minimum of headspace. So if I'm brewing a 5-liter batch of beer in the fermenter, I want at least a 7-liter capacity fermenter to put that beer into. Less than that, you risk the problem of, as this fermentation takes place, your beer is going to go right through that grommet, out the sides. It's going to make a big mess, and it's a potential contaminant as well, because now it's opening up a channel for wild yeast to grow into your beer. So if you don't want that to happen, give your beer enough headspace. Fermentation is actually a very violent process. It's very, very, it's hectic. The temperature gets raised during fermentation, and that yeast is really doing some stuff to the wort, and that's why you need the headspace. You can also use glass carboys. The Americans have almost endless supplies of these for some reason. That's why when you pick up a homebrew book written in America, they often advocate the use of glass carboys. Glass carboys are great. I mean, they're easy to clean. They're very airtight. They're not light tight though. So you've got to use caution here. If you're fermenting with glass carboy, you've got to put it in a dark room, or you've got to cover it in some sort of fabric or something which doesn't let light through, because the same applies to fermenting beer as it does to grated beer. It will skunk your beer if you get UV into it. But they're difficult to find in South Africa. But if you do find them, great. But you've got to be cautious, because glass obviously breaks. And this is a homemade one. Any food grade plastic container will do. Okay, so this is those huge whey protein kind of jars you get, the supplements. And these make great little fermenters. I often convert these into small batch fermenters, because they hold, often around about 10 liters capacity, which is great if you make a, sort of an 8-liter or a 9-liter batch. So they're great, and they're very light tight. They're often black or dark colors. Now, the main thing here, which you really have to keep in mind, is it has to be food grade. Okay, I'm not kidding about this. It really shocks me sometimes to see homebrewers take safety with a pinch of salt, because you are still manufacturing something here, and you don't want to risk your health. So use food grade plastic, please. And food grade plastics generally are your the PP plastics, and that you can find online the sort of different codes of plastics which are food grade. But basically, a good rule of thumb is, if the container contains some food product already, it's pretty safe, right? It's when it's not that obvious that it contains food where you have to be cautious. That's why these sort of whey protein stuff is good, because it is a food grade plastic. It is meant to store food, so it'll do just fine for you as well. Obviously, you're going to have to drill a hole in the lid to put your little grommet in and so on. I mean, that goes without saying. But again, that's something that's pretty easy to do. What you want to avoid, right, are a couple of things. So you really want to avoid anything which is not food grade. Okay, don't use your bin or any kind of rubberized sort of plastic. You get all sorts of weird plastics out there. They're often not, are not meant to contain food, so don't use them. Clear plastic containers, not great, because they let light through, and that is the disadvantage of the carboys as well. And then, anything which has been meant to carry fuels or solvents, not a good idea, okay? They're not food grade plastic, firstly, and if they have maybe in the past contained any kind of solvent, even if you rinse it out, it's not going to necessarily protect you from what was in that thing to begin with. So just to maintain some form of safety here, and you want to enjoy your own brew and not harm yourself in creating problems for yourself. Here are some bottle cappers. So there's 2 main types for most home brewers. There's the butterfly type and then the bench capper. As I'm getting older, I'm starting to prefer the bench capper because it's less effort. The butterfly one, requires a little bit more elbow grease, but they're fine. I mean, it lasts pretty much forever. My butterfly type, which I'm using, is still the one I bought initially. So it's been going strong now. It's now starting to show its age, so I might have to replace them. But they're perfectly fine. Nice feature of these is the capping sort of section of this thing, I don't really know what you call that, has a magnet inside. So it keeps the bottle cap in place as you put it on the bottle. So that's a pretty nifty feature of these cappers, is they're magnetized. Okay, so get one of these. This is not something you're going to make yourself. You're going to have to buy this. And here are some nice, what I call nice and soon to haves. A nice to have is something which really is nice to have. Soon to have for me is something which you're going to have to buy. You're going to convince yourself to buy it very rapidly because it has such a benefit to own. But I've put it in a separate category for you. So I've put gravity measures as a nice to have or a soon to have, because right away when you start with this hobby, you don't initially necessarily have to measure the gravity of your beer. It's great to start that way, but if you follow the recipe properly and you weigh your ingredients and you have a thermometer at least, then you're sure to get close to what you're trying to achieve. But I would say a soon to have would be a gravity measure, so that you can really start measuring the gravity of your beer. So when we talk about gravity of beer, it's simply it's a measure of the amount of dissolved material inside of a liquid. Okay, that's really what you're measuring. And there are two ways of doing that. So a beer hydrometer is this glass instrument here. And what you'll do is you'll take a sample of your beer in a kind of a test tube, which often is sold with these instruments. If not, you should buy a sort of a very cheap, home lab, school lab test tube is fine. And you take a sample of the beer and you suspend this little thing inside of it. It's got a weight here at the bottom, lead weights. And then you take a reading. So where it bobs at the level of the beer, you take that reading, and that's the gravity, the specific gravity of your beer at any given time. And it will change, right? So at the end of your boil, you'll measure it. This is usually when you measure it. So before you add the yeast, you'll measure it. And you're usually targeting a specific number depending on the recipe you're using. And if you hit the number, it suggests that, everything worked out well and all the things you try to put in the beer are in the right quantities. And then you will measure it as the beer ferments, because by measuring your beer, you can actually tell when you should bottle your beer. Most beer recipes will tell you what the final gravity of the beer should be. And so when it reaches that gravity, it's time to bottle. Well, you can bottle the beer. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to bottle the beer. But that's what we use hydrometers for. Refractometers, which look always to me like a bit of a lightsaber kind of thing, is pretty cool. They're way more expensive, okay? You can easily spend up to $1,000 on some of them. And they measure gravity differently. They measure through the refraction of light. And they only require like a little drop of liquid on that little plastic faceplate. And then you hold it up to the light and you read, sort of the measurement. And they're very, very accurate, of course. Great to use because they use very little wort. Not great to measure fermenting wort, though. There are adjustment calculations you can use, but in my experience, they're not often that accurate. But they are convenient. And if you're going to do a lot of small batch brewing, I like them for small batch brewing, because obviously if I'm brewing 5 liters of beer and I'm taking a sample of, let's say, 500 mils, that's a lot of beer, right, out of the total. Whereas when I use a refractometer, I can just use a little drop. This one I was tempted to put on the must-have, but I know they're expensive and sometimes difficult to get, and that's why they're on the soon-to-have. It's called an autosiphon, and you use it to rack your beer. So the technical term for moving beer around, racking beer. And you're going to use it when you bottle your beer, especially. So what you do is as the picture there suggests, is that sort of clear plastic stave you put inside of your fermentation, or in this case, the bottling bucket, which is the second bucket I told you to get. And then you pump it a few times, and then it creates a natural siphoning sort of system for you. The tube you will put in the bottom of the bottle, right at the bottom. You stick it right at the bottom. You fill it up until it reaches the top of the opening of the bottle, and then you stop it. Usually I just crimp it with my thumb. You can actually buy little crimpers and stuff. I don't really think that's necessary. You can also get a filler wand, which you can see here at the bottom, which you attach to the tube, and it's got a spring-loaded doohickey, which when you release it, it stops the flow of the beer. That is obviously a bit easier than using your thumb, and sometimes you can make a bit of a mess when you use your thumb because you get it wrong. But I don't like these filler stem ones just because I've never had a good experience with them, but it's maybe just because I really just had a couple of bum ones which I bought. I'm sure that some of them really work well. But I cannot actually, overemphasize how wonderful these things are. Because the alternative is that you're going to create your own racking cane, which is usually a sort of a plastic cane-like instrument. You can make it yourself very easily. And then you're either going to suck the beer out, which creates potential contamination because your mouth is not a very clean thing, or you can put water in it and let the water run out, and then it pulls the beer out with it. But it's a pain. It's a real pain. I didn't have autosiphon for the first year of brewing beer, and I really regret not having bought one earlier. This is usually the thing when it breaks is the first thing I replace. I will replace my autosiphon before I replace almost any other part of my brewing kit because it is so convenient to use. Just a tip, do not wash these things in hot water. They are the plastics they're made out of is pretty heat sensitive and they start cracking, which is why I have lost autosiphons in the past. So wash them in cold water, please. Okay, and obviously this has to be very well sterilized because it's going to be touching your cold, unheated beer. So the risk of contamination is real. And so you want to obviously sterilize these things very, very well. So autosiphon, get one, I would say. Some principles to keep in mind. I thought I would share some with you, which are really important in terms of making really, really good beer. So the first thing to do is to really get things sorted. So what I mean by that is, try and really prepare for brew day. Don't just sort of throw things together on the day. You're going to be disappointed. You're going to not enjoy your day because invariably you're going to be forgetting something along the way. And, it's just not going to be much fun. So really take some time to prepare, lay things out in the way you're going to use it. See if you've got everything and then go brew. So that's really something I learned the hard way, and I wouldn't want you to have to go through that as well. So really prepare. The other one is measure everything as much as you can, especially temperature and weights. So, take temperature seriously. When you're steeping your grain, try and keep it within that range. Try and make sure that you cool your wort to the right temperature before pitching the yeast to avoid yeast shock. And time, right? You're going to have to use a timer because the recipe you're going to follow is going to call for different additions during different times. It's going to say at 60 minutes, which is the beginning of the boil, add the hop, and at 15 minutes, add the hop. That stuff's not made up, right? It is pretty exact. So you're going to have to measure time and weigh your ingredients. Okay, weighing your ingredients is one of the surefire ways of making better beer than just sort of eyeballing it. Right. Third principle, sanitize everything which is going to touch your chilled wort. Very, very important. Okay, as soon as the wort reaches a temperature of below 6 degrees Celsius, it can support microbial life. And so you really do need to sanitize things which are going to touch chilled wort. And it's easy to forget something. It's easy to forget to, let's say, sanitize the thermometer you're going to use to measure whether your wort's at the right temperature. So you just have to be kind of diligent. Also, anything which touches yeast should be sanitized. So when you're rehydrating your yeast, obviously, you've got to sanitize everything. I usually spray the yeast packet with some sanitizer as well as the scissors I use to open. That might seem paranoid until you one day brew 19 liters of beer you're going to throw away. Or if you're a commercial brewer, thousands of liters of beer. So it's not worth it. It's better just to be careful. And it includes you, right? The human being in this whole equation is the least sanitary part of brewing. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Wash your hands regularly whilst brewing. Use sanitizing liquids. Wear clothes, shoes, the same stuff you would do in any food preparation, I guess. If you're bearded like I am, you've got to consider like maybe not, dipping your beard in your wort. It's not going to improve the flavor, I promise you. Other things also to keep in mind, if you've got pets, kind of banish the pets out of as much as you can. If you do small brews, it's as simple as closing the kitchen door maybe. But I usually banish my pets because they carry wild yeast in their fur. It's actually a very common source of wild yeast. And while some wild yeast can be used to brew beer, you don't want a random contribution. And then give your beer time. That's really, really important. I find a very common mistake with beginning homebrewers is they are too nervous about the beer and they mess with it too much and they don't want to give it time. Good beer takes time to make. and you don't have to keep on measuring it every day once it's in the fermenter. That's important. It does need, the yeast needs time to do its thing. A nice fact, though, for you to remember, and I see this is probably the single most commonly asked question or problem reported in homebrew forums or Facebook groups, is it goes something like this. I've put my beer in the fermenter. It was really fermenting very nicely because the bubbler was going crazy for the first 2 days, and now it's stopped. Now there's no more bubbles in the bubbler. Does this mean that my beer stopped fermenting? Has it stuck in the fermentation? Has it been contaminated? And people start worrying about that. But the bubbling airlock is the single worst indication of fermentation you can possibly rely on. Okay, the bubbler doesn't exist to tell you that the beer is fermenting. It exists to release pressure out of your fermentation vessel and not allow bad things to get into it, hence the vodka you're putting in. But it's not a measure of fermentation at all. There's so many things which will make that thing bubble or not. The grommets quality, there will almost certainly not be a hermetically sealed unit for you, right? So little bits of air, CO2 will escape, so it won't bubble. Or the headspace in your fermentation bucket could be such that it's not going to create bubbles at all. When I do small batch beers in larger fermentation vessels, all I notice is the liquid in the bubbler raises slightly. And you have to be very, observant to see that. So bubbling bubblers, airlocks, not a good indication of fermentation. Better indication, measuring your beer, right? Leave it for a couple of days and measure it, and you'll see the gravity has dropped significantly. A lot of homebrewers don't know this, but primary fermentation, in other words, the fermentation process where yeast basically converts much of the fermentable sugar in your wort into alcohol and CO2, only takes a couple of days, literally 2 to 3 days. That's it. So it's very quick. And so within 3 days, you might well observe the bubbler stopping, and that's actually normal. Because then the secondary fermentation processes start taking place where it's much slower, much more gentle. It's not going to churn up a lot of liquid, but the yeast is still doing work in that beer. So just keep that in mind. Don't let the bubbler fool you. And take notes. Apart from my autosiphon, the other most valuable thing I have when I brew is a notebook. I've got a very tatty one because it's had lots of words spilled on it over the years, but I still have it. And it still has notes from my very first beer I made. Take notes, that's how you're going to get better at this. If you don't take notes and you don't sort of record what you do, then every brew is going to be like your first. But it's useful to take notes. If you do something wrong during the brew day, or you think you did something wrong, note it and see if it actually made a difference in the final product. If your cat does happen to hop onto the table while you're bottling your beer and you think, oh boy, I wonder if this is contaminant, note it, literally, possible pet contamination, and see if it did anything. So taking notes while you brew is a way of really improving. And that's it. Sorry I went over time. I can talk all day about beer. I'm sure you can too. So before I get to the questions, just a reminder, you can connect with me at contact@beginnerbrewer.com. That's the email address you can use. I really do respond to the emails I receive. I don't let them lie. And you can find way more information at beginnerbrewer.com is the website with lots and lots and lots of articles I've written over the years on this stuff. There's some beer reviews there for locally made and international beers. I also record a podcast called Scum, Beer and Villainy. I don't record it nearly frequently enough, but myself and my friend Matt, we kind of talk about beer and geeky stuff if you're into that sort of thing. And there's some calculators on the side as well, which help you calculate various things in brewing, and we're trying to expand that as well. So please do visit and check it out. Now let me get to the questions before we go way over time. I know it's now beer o'clock, so I really do appreciate everyone who's still in this webinar, because you kind of, this is normally when people go to the pub, unless you are watching this in the pub, which is weird. Right, so let me get to the questions. I'm just quickly scrolling up. Okay, so I'm going to go right from the top. So what hops are commonly used to add to the Whirlpool? Well, almost any kind of variety of hop. In fact, that's kind of the point, is you can really experiment. Mostly it is the aromatic hops, so your low alpha acid hops. So as an example, if you're doing an American Pale Ale, you will use things like your your low alpha acid, like Cascade, for instance, or if you're doing an English one, you'll be using Fuggles or Goldings, or if you're doing German styles, you'll be using Hallertauer. And I mean, this is now obviously a very small sample of hops, but you can use high alpha acid hops as well. And in fact, a lot of the research recently and a lot of the craft brewers who've been experimenting with that have found really interesting flavors being extracted from hops which are traditionally used for bittering, but when you add them in the Whirlpool, their flavor compounds are contributed as well. So things like Centennial, Chinook, Magnum, even high alpha acid hops can produce some really cool flavor if you add them to the Whirlpool. So thanks for that. It's a great question. How important is water pH? Well, it's important in the sense that when you do all grain brewing and you're mashing your grains, it needs to be at the right pH for the enzymes to function properly. And the wrong pH in your brew can slow down or even stop enzymatic action, which means you're not going to have a full conversion of starch to sugar in the mash. If you're using extracts and specialty grains, however, you don't have to worry about pH because it's already been made for you, right? The malt extract is already mashed, for you. That's how it was created. So pH becomes unimportant. Having said that, if you do ever go into all grain brewing, what's nice about it is the grains themselves change the pH level of the water you use, right? And so that is kind of interesting. It's a little bit acidic, mostly, the grains. And that's why I say beer wants to be made, because more often than not, if you add the right amount of grains to your mash, it will change the pH of the water to the right pH. And so you don't need to treat the water in any way. And so that's the first step to do is just don't mess with your water and see whether adding grains will be fine. And usually it is. It's very rare for me to treat my water for pH when I do all grain brewing. Okay, with different bowl sizes, are the caps different too? That's a good question. No, they're not. They're generally not. So there seems to be a standard size of bottle cap. So whether you're using 330s, 440s, 660s, 750s, they all use the same bottle cap. I've never seen, it's an interesting question, but I must say in all the years I've brewed, I've never seen that be different. Maybe champagne bottles, some of them might have funny shape, funny sizes, but even most of the commercial champagne bottles I've used take a normal crown cap. So you don't need different sizes. They do obviously come in different colors and all that sort of thing. And you can't reuse them. Please don't reuse your crown caps. They're cheap, okay? So don't be that cheap in your brewing because they have a lining which leaches out oxygen from your beer, which is a good thing. And that kind of deteriorates. So you shouldn't be reusing them. On the high pressure regulator, screwed in or out, it's screwing in that little thing increases the pressure, but generally they are already at the right level. So you don't generally have to mess with them. I must admit, I'm not a very technically minded guy when it comes to high pressure burners, but I've not really detected much difference in messing with that thing. So generally just, ask the person you buy it from, but generally I found, the setting they're on when you buy them is pretty much what you need. Right, so you can use no-rinse sanitizer instead of vodka. There's the question. But the problem with, like I said, no-rinse sanitizer has a shelf life which is very unstable. So most of your no-rinse sanitizers, like Perasan, peracetic acid, has a shelf life. Once you've diluted it in water, it'll only last for about a day or two before it really reverts. But that's why they're no-rinse, by the way. They're no-rinse because they revert to, sort of dangerous chemicals naturally. And so obviously that will take place inside of the airlock as well, in which case now you just have like regular water, which can maintain microbial life, which is why I prefer something like vodka. The correct temperature to measure your gravity with the hydrometer, you will firstly see inside of the hydrometer, right at the top, usually printed inside of the measurement sort of face, it will say what temperature it's been calibrated with. Most modern hydrometers are calibrated at 20 degrees Celsius. So if your beer wort is very different from that, it will change the reading a little bit. And online you can find hydrometer adjustment calculators. So you just input the calibration temperature, which usually is 20, and your wort temperature, and it'll give you the adjustment. It's very little. I mean, 5 degrees either way is not going to make a difference in the reading. So it's pretty accurate at anything from 15 to 25 degrees Celsius, which is sort of the range of most worts that you're going to measure. Older hydrometers, if you've got an ancient one, some of them are calibrated at funny temperatures. So you just have to check inside the hydrometer to see. Good question. Why would you want to transfer from the fermenter bucket to the bottling bucket? Well, it's very simple. So I don't like using sort of sugar drops or those carbonation drops. I don't trust them, firstly, because some of them are ancient, and I don't like putting really old stuff in my beer. The other reason why is I want to control the carbonation much more carefully in my beer. And I also don't want to put things which are at the bottom of the fermenter inside the bottle. So at the end of fermentation, in the bottom of that fermenter, you'll notice when you're now cleaning your stuff afterwards, it's formed a massive cake of yeast. There's hop residue, there's dead yeast cells in there, and so on. You can use some of that stuff and wash it and create your own yeast. That's a topic for a different webinar. But you don't want that stuff in your beer, right? That's not great. So one of the reasons you're transferring it out of that is to clarify your beer even further. And I mentioned last time that, clear beer is just a wonderful thing to have. The other one is that you'll mix some sugar, right? So dextrose, glucose, or table sugar you can use to carbonate your beer before you bottle it. Okay, so, and depending on the volume of carbonation you require, the recipe will tell you how much to use. And so let's say you're brewing a batch and you're putting 200 grams or so of glucose in. What you will do is you'll take some sterile water, brewing water. You'll mix just enough in so that it dissolves that sugar. You'll boil the sugar for 10 minutes to sterilize everything. Remember, the rule of thumb of anything boiled for 10 minutes can be considered sterile. And then you'll put that liquid, sugar syrup basically you've created, not a syrup, but liquid, at the bottom of the bottling bucket. That way, when you then transfer the beer into the bottling bucket from the fermenter with your autosiphon, just saying, it mixes naturally. You don't have to stir it. The motion of it being transferred will mix it quite sufficiently. You just do it slowly and from the bottom up so that you don't introduce oxygen. And then that sugar solution is now uniformly distributed across your entire batch of beer. And then you can easily go and bottle it without any problems. I just find the drops, sometimes they don't dissolve properly. They give problems. I'm not a fan. And that's why. So for clarifying beer and for mixing in your sugar is the reason I would use a bottling bucket. Okay, I think that's about it. Sorry that I've gone so far over time. I will let you go now and go and have a beer. I see some of you already left to go and have that beer. I'm going to go and have a beer now. But please do drop me a line at contact@beginnerbrewer.com for any more questions you may have. And I'd really appreciate it. I'm going to post the recording of this on the YouTube channel, which you should go and visit and subscribe to, please. And so you can show people who may have missed the presentation. And then I hope to see you all very, very soon. I will also, by the way, if it's okay with those of you remaining, if I can subscribe you to our newsletter, you can easily unsubscribe when you get the first one if you don't like it. But I do post some interesting things there. There's some sort of subscriber-only recipes and so on, which I send. And it's just once a month. So if it's okay with everyone, I'll do that, and you can see if you like it. Okay. Thanks so very much. And I'm looking forward to the beer school as well. I'm going to be posting information on when the first one happens. I'm just sorting out my video equipment, and then it's going to take place. So thanks again for everyone's great questions. And it was really nice interacting with you again. And happy homebrewing.